her true story from Ohio Cove. They made me pay rent in my own house, so I took back the keys and left them outside. The first of the month always came with a knot in my stomach. It wasn't the kind of dread you get from a bill you can't pay, but the kind you get from an indignity you have to swallow. The kitchen clock read 7:15 in the morning, its persistent ticking the only sound breaking the uncomfortable silence that had become our family's new language. The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of freshly ground coffee, the expensive Colombian blend Jessica insisted we buy, and the sound of my son David's silence as he scrolled through his phone. His wedding ring caught the morning light streaming through the window, the same window where Tom and I used to watch the sunrise together with our morning coffee. Now it felt like a spotlight, illuminating everything we'd lost. Across the table, his wife, Jessica, tapped her perfectly manicured nails on the granite countertop I had picked out with my late husband, Tom, 25 years ago. Each tap was deliberate, rhythmic, like a countdown to an execution. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek bun that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and her silk blouse was wrinkle-free, despite it being barely past dawn. She was the kind of woman who looked put together even when delivering an ultimatum. "Margaret," she said, her voice bright and brittle, like thin ice cracking underfoot. The way she said my name, not mom, never mom, was a reminder of my place in this hierarchy she'd constructed. "It's the first. Did you forget?" I didn't look up from the placemat I was wiping, a placemat that had been part of my wedding set from 1972. The fabric was worn thin from decades of family dinners, birthday celebrations, and quiet conversations between Tom and me. Now it felt like evidence of a life that no longer mattered. "No, dear, it's on the corner of the dresser, in the envelope, like always." She sighed, a theatrical puff of air meant to convey her long-suffering patience. It was the same sigh she used when explaining something to her subordinates at work, a sound that made you feel both foolish and small. "I just wish you'd be more punctual. We have our own budget, you know. That $500 is factored in. We rely on it." "We rely on it." The words echoed in the small space between us, bouncing off the walls I had painted with Tom's help 3 summers ago. My son didn't flinch. He just took another sip of his coffee, his eyes glued to the screen, as if the fate of the world rested on a stock market ticker. The David I'd raised would have defended me. This David, this stranger, wearing my son's face, was a spectator in his own life, and a bystander in mine. I caught a glimpse of his phone screen. He was scrolling through luxury vacation rentals in Cabo. $500 of my pension money, apparently, went toward dreaming of beaches I'd never see. I nodded, my lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll be sure to bring it down before I make breakfast." The walk back to my room felt longer each month. I passed the family photos lining the hallway, pictures of David's childhood, his college graduation, his wedding day. In every single one, I was smiling, proud, hopeful. That woman in the photographs felt like a stranger now. My room, the small back bedroom that used to be our sewing room, was barely large enough for a twin bed and a small dresser. Tom and I had planned to turn it into a nursery if we'd been blessed with more children. Instead, it had become my refuge, then my prison, and now my countdown chamber. I picked up the white envelope from the corner of my dresser, right next to the framed photograph of Tom in his army uniform. Inside were 5 crisp $100 bills. Money from my widow's pension money Tom had literally died for, serving his country for 4 years before coming home to build us a life. Money I was paying to live in the house that was already mine. As I walked back to the kitchen, I could hear Jessica on the phone with her mother, her voice suddenly warm and animated. "Oh yes, the house is perfect for entertaining. We're thinking of installing a wine fridge in the basement. David's mother contributes to the household expenses, so we can afford to make some upgrades." David's mother, not Margaret, not grandma-to-be, David's mother, like a piece of furniture that came with the house. I placed the envelope on the kitchen island. Right next to the bowl of organic avocados, Jessica bought every week $20 worth of fruit that would sit there until it rotted because none of us actually liked avocados. "But they looked sophisticated," she'd explained once, when I suggested we buy regular fruit instead. She picked up the envelope without a thank you, counted the bills quickly, her banker's instincts never dormant, and tucked it into her designer purse. The Louis Vuitton bag cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. The transaction was complete. I was no longer a mother in her home. I was a tenant who had paid her rent. And the worst part? I had agreed to it. I had been a fool, a quiet, grieving, accommodating fool. But every fool has her breaking point, and for the past 3 years I had been documenting every single indignity in a place they never thought to look. In the memo line of my checkbook register, where I recorded the withdrawal each month, I wrote the same 4 words: rent for my own roof. It was a quiet rebellion. A ledger of shame they had forced me to keep, and that ledger was about to be called due. But before I tell you about my liberation, let me tell you about my imprisonment. Tom and I bought this house in 1985. The realtor, a kind woman named Dorothy with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, had shown us 17 houses over 2 months. This one wasn't the biggest or the fanciest, but when we walked through the front door, Tom squeezed my hand and whispered, "This is it, Maggie. This is home." It wasn't much, Thena, simple 2-story colonial on a street lined with young maple trees in a sleepy suburb of Columbus, Ohio. The kitchen was avocado green, a color that was already going out of style. The carpet was burnt orange shag that looked like it had survived the 70s by sheer willpower alone. The backyard was more weeds than grass, and the front porch sagged slightly to the left. But it was ours. Tom was a union carpenter, a man whose hands were calloused from work but gentle in touch. He could build anything from a bookshelf to a life. I remember our first night in the house. We didn't even have a bed yet, just a mattress on the floor of what would become our bedroom. Tom pulled out his toolbox and said, "First things first, Maggie. We need to build something together in this house." He spent 3 hours building me a simple wooden shelf for the kitchen, measuring twice and cutting once, the way his father had taught him. That shelf still hangs in the kitchen today. It's where I keep my recipe cards, including the one for Tom's favorite chocolate chip cookies, written in my mother's handwriting. I was a secretary at the local elementary school, a job I kept for 30 years. Every morning, I'd wave goodbye to Tom as he left for the construction site, and every evening, I'd have dinner waiting when he came home, his work boots caked with sawdust and his smile tired but genuine. We lived paycheck to paycheck those first few years, but we were building something. Tom would come home with salvaged materials from job sites, a beautiful piece of oak here, some marble tile there, and slowly, over weekends and evenings, our house became a home. He built custom cabinets for the kitchen. I sewed curtains for every window. We planted the maple tree in the front yard the year David was born, a tiny sapling that's now taller than the house itself. We paid our mortgage every month for 30 years. We never missed a payment, even during the recession of the early 90s, when Tom's work dried up for 6 months, and I took a second job cleaning offices at night. We celebrated in this kitchen when the final payment cleared, dancing to an old Frank Sinatra record on our portable player. Tom held me close and whispered, "It's all ours now, Maggie. No one can ever take this away from us." He passed away 2 years later, in the master bedroom upstairs, leaving me with a paid-off house and a heart full of memories. The loneliness was a heavy blanket that I couldn't shake off. The house, which had once been filled with Tom's whistling and the sound of his projects, became an echo chamber of silence. I'd wake up in the morning and for just a moment forget he was gone, turning to tell him about a dream or ask if he wanted coffee. The emptiness would hit me fresh each time. David would call every few days, but the conversations felt stilted, formal. "How are you doing, Mom?" He'd ask, and I'd say, "Fine, honey," because what else could I say? That I talked to his father's picture every morning? That I sometimes set 2 plates for dinner out of habit? That I was drowning in a house full of memories? So when David and Jessica suggested they move in a year later, it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "It makes sense, Mom," David had said, his arm around my shoulder as we sat on the porch swing Tom had built. "We can help with the upkeep, and you won't be alone. We'll be a family." Jessica had nodded enthusiastically, her engagement ring catching the porch light. "I've always wanted to live in a real home, Margaret. Our apartment downtown is so sterile. This place has character, history. We could all take care of it together." It sounded like a prayer answered. They moved in on a sunny Saturday in March, and at first, it was wonderful. The house was full of life again. Jessica would cook elaborate dinners, and David would help with yard work, trimming the hedges I could no longer reach and fixing the loose shingles on the roof. We'd sit together in the evenings, watching television or playing cards, and for a few precious months, I felt like I had a family again. But slowly, like a photograph fading in sunlight, things began to change. Jessica, a project manager at a tech firm downtown, started optimizing the house. It began with small suggestions. "Margaret, these floral curtains are so dated. What if we tried something more contemporary?" My grandmother's china cabinet was taking up too much space in the dining room. The wooden rocking chair where I'd nursed David as a baby was probably not safe anymore and found its way to the dining room. Basement. My floral curtains, the ones I'd sewn by hand during David's nap times when he was 2 years old, were replaced with minimalist gray blinds that blocked out most of the sunlight. My comfortable, worn-out armchair, the one where Tom used to read me the newspaper every Sunday morning, was moved to the basement because it clashed with the aesthetic. "We're not throwing anything away," Jessica would assure me with a bright smile. "We're just creating a more cohesive living space, more modern, more intentional." Intentional. That was her favorite word. Our house needed to be intentional. The photographs came down next. "Family photos are so personal," she explained as she carefully wrapped my wedding pictures in tissue paper. "When we have guests, it might make them feel excluded." The walls, once covered with decades of memories, became bare and white, punctuated only by abstract art pieces Jessica had bought online. Then came the conversation about finances. It was a Thursday evening in October, almost exactly 6 months after they'd moved in. David was working late, and Jessica had prepared what she called a family meeting. She'd even made a PowerPoint presentation on her laptop. "Margaret, we were thinking," Jessica began, her voice taking on the professional tone she used for client presentations. "To make it fair for everyone, we should all contribute to the household expenses proportionally." She clicked to the first slide, Household Budget Analysis. There were pie charts and graphs, color, coded and meticulously calculated. "We're paying for utilities, groceries, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. It's only right that you contribute something too. A small monthly rent, just to keep things equitable." I was stunned. "Rent? But the house is paid for." "It's not about the mortgage," she'd said smoothly, clicking to the next slide, Fair Market Value Assessment. "It's about the shared cost of living. Look, if you were renting a room anywhere else in this neighborhood, you'd pay at least $800 a month. We're only asking for $500. Think of it as your share of the household expenses." David had come home in the middle of this presentation, his tie loosened and his face tired from a long day. He'd looked at the laptop screen, then at me, then at Jessica. For a moment, I thought he might object. I thought the son I'd raised, the boy who used to defend me from playground bullies, might stand up for his mother. Instead, he'd nodded slowly. "It makes sense, Mom. We're all adults here. Everyone should contribute." I was grieving. I was lonely. I didn't want to start a fight in the house that was supposed to bring us together, so I agreed. I started paying them $500 a month to live in my own home. My money from the pension Tom had earned through decades of hard labor was now funding their lifestyle, their weekend trips to wine country, Jessica's weekly mani pedis, David's new golf clubs that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. But it wasn't just the money. It was the way I became invisible in my own home. There was the incident with the soup. I'd been making my mother's chicken soup recipe, one with extra garlic and fresh dill that Tom had loved. The kitchen smelled like my childhood, like Sunday dinners and family gatherings. I was humming while I stirred, lost in memories of better times. Jessica walked in, took one breath, and wrinkled her nose like she'd smelled something rotten. "Oh, Margaret, we talked about this. Strong cooking odors affect the resale value of the house. They get into the fabrics, the walls. It's hard to get them out." But it's just soup, I'd said weakly. I know, but we're trying to maintain a certain standard. What if we have guests? What if David's boss comes over? First impressions matter. She'd opened all the windows, turned on the exhaust fan, and lit 3 vanilla candles. Maybe next time you could make something less aromatic? The next week, I found a list on the refrigerator, kitchen guidelines for shared living. No garlic, no onions, no fish, no Indian spices, no anything that might leave a lingering scent. My cooking something I'd taken pride in for 40 years was reduced to bland, odorless meals that tasted like nothing and reminded me of hospital food. Then there was the evening I tried to share some news with David. I'd received a letter from the school district informing me that they were naming the new library wing after Tom. In recognition of all the volunteer work he'd done building bookshelves and reading corners over the years, I was so proud, so excited to share this honor with my son. I found David and Jessica in the living room, both staring at their phones. "David, honey, I have some wonderful news about your father." "Hold on, Mom," he'd said without looking up. "I'm in the middle of something important." Jessica hadn't even acknowledged that I'd spoken. She was scrolling through Instagram, double-tapping photos of her friends' vacation pictures. I stood there for 10 minutes, holding the letter, waiting for a pause in their digital lives. Finally, I gave up and went to my room. I called my sister Helen instead, and we cried together over the phone about how proud Tom would have been. David never did ask about my news. But the breaking point, the moment when the last thread of my patience finally snapped, came on a Tuesday morning in late November. I had gotten up early to make coffee, a habit I'd maintained since Tom's passing. The house was quiet, peaceful even, in those pre-dawn hours. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the first light creep across the frost-covered lawn, when I heard voices from the living room. David and Jessica were up earlier than usual, their voices low but clear in the morning stillness. "If we can get another $500 a month out of your mom, we can afford the marble countertops," Jessica was saying. I could hear papers rustling, probably more of her charts and spreadsheets. "We'll just tell her the property taxes went up again. She won't know the difference." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. David hesitated for a second, and for a moment, I thought my son might still exist somewhere inside this stranger. "I don't know, Jess. $1,000 a month seems like a lot to ask." "Don't be soft, David," she snapped, her voice sharp with irritation. "She's sitting on a paid-off house worth $300,000. It's the least she can do. She barely contributes anything around here anyway. It's not like she's earning her keep." Earning her keep, in the house Tom and I had built with our own 2 hands. In the home where I'd raised David, where I'd nursed him through childhood illnesses and helped him with homework and taught him how to tie his shoes. Where I'd sacrificed my own dreams so he could go to college, where I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his wedding. I stood in that hallway, my coffee growing cold in my hands, feeling something die inside my chest. It wasn't just my heart breaking, it was my illusions shattering, the last of my hope crumbling like old mortar. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my small room, staring at the photograph of Tom on my dresser. "What would you do?" I whispered to his smiling face. "How do I fix this?" And then I remembered something he used to say when we faced a problem. "Maggie, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. And when they try to take what's yours, remind them who owns the deed." I went down to the basement and opened Tom's old military footlocker, the olive green metal chest he'd brought home from his service. Beneath his folded uniform and service medals, beneath the purple heart he'd earned but never talked about, was a thick manila folder. I pulled it out with trembling hands. The deed, signed, sealed, and recorded in 1985, owner, Margaret and Thomas Vance, and a second document, filed after his death, making me the sole owner. The house was mine, had always been mine, would always be mine. But more than that, I found something else in that folder: dignity, self, respect, the knowledge that I didn't have to take this abuse lying down. The next morning, I didn't make them coffee. I didn't prepare breakfast. I didn't play the role of the grateful tenant in my own home. Instead, I made a phone call. Mr. Peterson, I said, my voice steady for the first time in months. This is Margaret Vance, Tom's wife. I need to schedule an appointment. It's a matter of tenancy. Mr. Peterson was the lawyer who had handled Tom's will. A kind, no-nonsense man in his late 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd seen every kind of human behavior. His office was on High Street, in a brick building that had been there since the 1920s. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I walked in, carrying my folder of documents and 3 years' worth of checkbook registers. When I sat in his dusty office and laid out the Storyevry humiliating detail, every indignity, every month of paying rent in my own home, his face grew hard. He looked at the deed, then at a copy of my checkbook register with its monthly entries, rent for my own roof. He shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was tight with anger. "This is unconscionable, Margaret," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "This isn't just disrespectful, this is a form of elder abuse, financial exploitation. If I were a prosecutor, I'd consider filing charges." "I don't want to send them to jail," I said quietly. "I just want my house back." "A simple eviction notice should do it," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Since they've established a landlord-tenant relationship by accepting rent from you, we can terminate their tenancy with proper notice. The irony is almost poetic. They've created the very legal mechanism for their own removal." He drafted the papers that afternoon. 30 days' notice to vacate. Legal, binding, and absolutely airtight. As I signed my name at the bottom, my hand didn't shake. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was in control of my own life. The certified letter arrived on a Friday morning. I had planned it that way, timing my weekend visit to my sister Helen's house in Dayton so I wouldn't be there when they received it. I needed the distance, the space to prepare for what was coming. My phone started ringing at 6 p.m. It was David. I didn't answer. Then Jessica. Then David again. By midnight, I had 17 missed calls and a dozen voicemails. One message, from David, was choked with disbelief. "Mom, we got some kind of legal notice from a lawyer. It's an eviction notice. It says we have 30 days to vacate the premises. This has to be a joke, right? This has to be some kind of mistake. Jessica is. She's not taking this well. Please call me back. We need to talk about this." Another, from Jessica, was pure fury. "Margaret, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this stops now. You can't just kick us out of our home because you're having some kind of senior moment. David is your son. How could you do this to family?" I didn't call back. I turned off my phone and helped Helen make dinner, feeling lighter than I had in years. The next day, I received a series of increasingly frantic texts from Jessica. "Margaret, what is this? You can't evict us. This is our home. David is your son. How could you do this to your own son? We will sue you for this. This is illegal. Answer your phone right now, or we're calling the police. I've talked to 3 lawyers, and they all say this is elder abuse." Mr. Peterson had already warned me about this phase. "They'll threaten legal action," he'd said calmly. "They'll claim you're incompetent, that you don't understand what you're doing. Let them make their calls. Every lawyer in town will tell them the same thing. You have every legal right to evict tenants from your own property." Jessica did call his office. He later told me she'd been quite animated during their brief conversation. He calmly informed her that as I was the sole legal owner of the property and they were considered month-to-month tenants, the 30-day notice was perfectly legal and binding. When she threatened to sue, he'd chuckled and told her she was welcome to waste her money trying. When I returned on Sunday evening, the house felt different. The air was thick with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. They were waiting for me in the living room, David pacing by the window, Jessica sitting rigidly on the couch with her arms crossed. They looked like a jury ready to deliver a verdict, except I was no longer the defendant in my own home. "You can't do this," David said, his voice pleading. His hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "This is our home. Where are we supposed to go?" I set my purse on the tableau, asking permission, not apologizing for the space it took up. "I don't know, David." I replied, meeting his eyes steadily. but you have 30 days to figure it out. I believe there are many places in this city that charge rent. You should be familiar with the concept." Jessica stood up, her face a mask of fury. She was still beautiful, still perfectly put together, but there was something desperate in her eyes now. "After everything we've done for you, we let you live here, we paid the bills, we took care of this place. You lived in my paid-off house for 3 years, rent-free," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the granite countertop she loved so much. "You charged me to live in my own home. You redecorated my memories out of existence. You made me feel like a stranger in the house my husband and I built together. You didn't let me live here, you profited off me. And now, the lease is up." David tried a different approach, his voice breaking. "Mom, I'm your son. I'm all the family you have left. Dad would want us to stick together." That's when something fierce and protective rose up in me, something that had been dormant for too long. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Don't you dare invoke your father's name to justify what you've done. Tom worked his fingers to the bone to pay for this house. He died knowing it was secure, knowing I'd have a home for the rest of my life. And you, his son, you turned me into a tenant in my own home. You charged me rent with money from his pension. Your father would be ashamed of the man you've become." The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. David's face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the little boy who used to run to me when he skinned his knee. But that little boy was gone, had been gone for years, and I'd been too lonely and desperate to admit it. The next 30 days were a masterpiece of awkward silence and passive-aggressive warfare. Jessica tried everything: tears, rage, bargaining, more threats of legal action. She called David's childhood friends, trying to get them to intervene. She even called my sister Helen, spinning a story about my deteriorating mental state and how worried she was about my ability to live alone. Helen, bless her heart, listened patiently and then said, "Jessica, dear, my sister sounds more clear-headed than she has in years. Maybe you should start looking for apartments." They tried withholding their share of the utilities, as if that would somehow change the legal reality of their situation. When the electricity bill arrived, I paid it myself with money I'd saved by not having to fund their lifestyle anymore. David attempted to negotiate, suggesting they could stay if they paid me actual rent. "We could make this work, Mom. A real rental agreement, fair market value." "I'm not a landlord, David," I told him. "I'm your mother, or I was. I won't be collecting rent from my own son in my own home. That relationship is over." The day they moved out was March 15th, exactly 3 years and 1 week after they'd moved in. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was quiet, surprisingly so. No dramatic confrontations, no final screaming match. They'd hired movers, professional men who wrapped their belongings efficiently and loaded them into a truck with practiced indifference. I watched from the kitchen window as they carried out the minimalist furniture they'd brought, the abstract art that had replaced my family photos, the expensive gadgets and devices that had cluttered my clean surfaces. It felt like watching a fever break, like toxins being drawn out of a wound. As David carried the last box to their rented truck, he paused at the front door. The same door where Tom used to lift him up to reach the doorbell when he was small, the same threshold he'd carried his new bride across on their wedding day. "Was it worth it, Mom?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Losing your family over a few $1,000s?" I was sitting at the kitchen table, holding the teacup Tom had bought me for our 20th anniversary, the one with tiny roses painted around the rim. It had been packed away in the basement for 3 years, deemed too busy for Jessica's aesthetic. Now it was back where it belonged. "David," I said, looking him straight in the eye, "you didn't lose your family, you sold it, for $500 a month." He didn't have an answer for that. He just turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Jessica was already in the passenger seat of their car, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling her mother to complain about the injustice of it all. The truck pulled away, and then their car followed. I watched until they turned the corner, until the sound of their engines faded into the everyday noise of the neighborhood. Then I sat in my kitchen and listened to the silence. It wasn't the oppressive silence of loneliness I'd known before. This was different. This was peace. That evening, I walked through my empty, quiet house room by room. It felt bigger, cleaner, like a space that had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. I went into the master bedroom. My bedroom again opened the windows and let the cool Ohio air sweep through the rooms, clearing out the last 3 years of resentment and compromise. I found my floral curtains in the basement, carefully folded and preserved. I rehung them in the living room, and suddenly the afternoon light was golden and warm again instead of gray and sterile. I brought my comfortable chair back upstairs, positioned it by the window where it belonged. I hung my family photos back on the walls, filling the white spaces with decades of love and memory. The next morning I changed the locks. It felt ceremonial, like the final step in reclaiming my territory. The locksmith, a young man with kind eyes, seemed to understand the significance without being told. "Fresh start?" he asked as he handed me the new keys. "Something like that," I replied. But I didn't stop there. I had a larger vision, a purpose that had been forming during those long, quiet months of documentation and planning. I didn't sell the house. I couldn't. It was Tom's house. It was my home. But I also couldn't ignore what had happened to me, couldn't pretend that my experience was unique. Instead, I used the money I had saved, the $18,000 in rent I had paid them over 3 years, plus the money I no longer had to contribute to their lifestyle, for a different kind of restoration. I found a small, dusty storefront on High Street, just 3 blocks from Mr. Peterson's office. It had been a flower shop once, then a used bookstore, then empty for 2 years. The rent was reasonable, and it had good bones-high ceilings, large windows, and a warmth that reminded me of better times. I hired a young, idealistic lawyer fresh out of Ohio State's law school, a brilliant woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in elder law and had fire in her eyes when she talked about justice. Together, we launched the Vance Center for Senior Advocacy. Our mission was simple: to provide free legal advice to elderly people facing housing issues and financial abuse. The center wasn't just about legal help. We offered financial planning services, emotional support groups, and education seminars. We taught seniors how to protect themselves from predatory family members, how to spot the warning signs of financial abuse, and most importantly, how to remember their own worth. Our first client was Dorothy, the 78-year-old woman whose grandson had moved in to help and ended up stealing her Social Security checks. Our second was Robert, whose daughter had convinced him to sign over power of attorney and then sold his house out from under him. The stories were heartbreakingly similar: adult children who saw their parents not as people to be honored and protected, but as resources to be exploited. Family members who confused love with ownership, who believed that blood relation gave them the right to abuse and control. Within 6 months, we were helping dozens of families. The local news picked up our story, and suddenly I was fielding calls from all over Ohio, then from across the Midwest. Other lawyers wanted to start similar centers in their communities. Social workers began referring clients to us. We were making a difference. The day that changed everything came 8 months after David and Jessica had moved out. I was at the center, reviewing case files with Sarah, when I looked up to see a familiar figure standing in the doorway. David stood there, looking lost and smaller than I remembered. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. He looked around the office at the motivational posters, the comfortable chairs where scared seniors found hope, the wall of thank you cards from families we'd helped. "We're living in a 2-bedroom apartment across town," he said without preamble. "Jessica is working 2 jobs now. The tech company downsized, and she was one of the first to go. It's hard." I didn't say anything. I just gestured to the waiting room, where Mrs. Mornia Patterson, an 82-year-old woman whose nephew had been forging checks in her name, was waiting patiently to speak with Sarah. She looked scared, vulnerable, exactly the way I had felt for 3 long years. David followed my gaze and seemed to understand. His face changed, the self-pity replaced by something that might have been recognition. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. I was weak. I let us become people Dad would never recognize." Yes, you were, I said, not unkindly. But this place isn't about your regret, David. It's about making sure other sons are stronger, other mothers are safer. He nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. He looked around the office again, taking in the mission statement on the wall, the photographs of families we'd helped, the evidence of purpose I'd built from the ashes of my humiliation. He turned to leave, but I called his name, David. He stopped, hope flickering in his expression. Your father would be so ashamed, I said quietly. But maybe if you become the man he raised you to be, maybe someday he'd be proud again. That was the last key I had to give him, the key to the truth, the key to redemption if he chose to use it. It's been 2 years since then. The Vance Center has helped over 300 families receive the justice they deserved. My life had found a new purpose, one forged in the fire of betrayal but built on a foundation of compassion. One evening, I stayed late, organizing files for a new case. The streetlights outside cast long, golden stripes across the office floor. The silence wasn't lonely, it was productive. It was the sound of work being done. The bell on the door chimed, and I looked up to see David standing there. He didn't look like the confident man who had sat silently while his wife demanded rent. He looked tired, worn down by the consequences of his own weakness. I just wanted to see it, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He gestured around the room, the place you built. I nodded, waiting. Mom, he began, his voice cracking. Is there anything at all I can do to earn my way back? I thought for a long moment, looking not at him, but at the wall of thank you cards behind him. I thought of Tom, and the promise of a safe home he had left me. No, David, I said, my voice gentle but firm. You can't earn back what you willingly gave away. This isn't about us anymore. But there is something you can do. I pointed to a stack of flyers on the counter. You can take one of these. You can tell people about this place. You can be the man who helps prevent other sons from making the same mistake you did. That is the only rent you can pay now. He stared at me, the truth of my words settling in his eyes. He slowly picked up a flyer, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He just nodded, turned, and walked out into the night. I watched him go, not with bitterness, but with a quiet peace. He had wanted the keys to my house, but I had given him something far more valuable, the key to his own character. It was up to him to build something worthy with it. And as I turned off the lights and locked the door to the center, I knew I had finally, truly, come home. If you have ever been made a stranger in your own home, remember this: the locks can always be changed. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because here, we don't just take back the keys. We build new doors.